Hey there, Patreons. Welcome to the temporarily paywalled continuation of the main feed interview of episode 4, Courage in Resistance with Ben Case. Super grateful for your support, and I hope this project brings some joy, hope, and utility to your ears and works and days. And, I'll just reiterate that my plan for Part 2 episodes is to review and maybe reflect a little beforehand on what I learned in Part 1 and then roll the rest of the conversation and then return with some further reflections. But for this episode, I think the interview covered its topic well. And so I wanted to do the last segment on the mystery of Graham Platner. So just a brief review of Part 1. Ben and I discussed how bravery in anti-fascism means being able to risk yourself for others in a bunch of different ways, with your body, but also maybe with your words. He said that it was embodied and strengthened like a muscle through practice. And we also talked about the benefits of training, martial arts or combat arts training, because that stuff can help prepare people for protest situations in which they might be put in uncomfortable positions or in which they might experience pain or the rush of adrenaline. And so they can understand better what's happening if they're being restrained or if they're being boxed in or being physically obstructed or attacked in some way. Physical preparation helps avoid panic. It helps us control our reactions, and it helps us decide when the action that we're taking is symbolic versus strategic. I think what I liked best about what he said about that stuff is that if you have some experience with conflict physically in a safe and consensual environment, you know something about how to keep connected with your own values when you're under stress. And I thought that was very powerful. Now, we also talked about the mythology of polite protesting and how mainstream U.S. liberal culture often idealizes, maybe naively and maybe unrealistically, the nonviolent marches of the past or movements of the past as being orderly and often ignoring the disruptive and confrontational tactics that were also essential for the successes of those movements. Now, the one thing I want to mention here before rolling the second half of the interview is that the work that Ben and others do on anti-fascism is super nuanced. You've got to explore these issues of how people, both now and historically, have been willing to go physically to defend themselves or their community members. Like, is it okay to punch Nazis? When is that okay? Why could it be okay? What are we to say and think about struggling with the cops to de-arrest a neighbor? What's the difference between violence to people and violence to property? But in just having that conversation, you can get backed into a corner. And the corner is that for you to be historically descriptive of the reality of violence and political change means risking being accused of advocating for violence in political change. If you try to be a sociologist of how violent responses emerge against repressive regimes historically, you can be accused of supporting, endorsing, whitewashing, or minimizing the nature of violent responses. And that means the accuser has taken your description of history as a prescription for the future or as a justification for a present atrocity. Now, we see this play out in discourse showdowns about the genocide in Gaza all the time, where if you even begin to say that the conditions for October the 7th, 2023 were set in motion 77 years before, you can be accused of endorsing October the 7th and making it sound like it was morally justified rather than materially, sociologically, and psychologically predictable. And then that accusation gets extrapolated out into, so would you approve of X group doing something similar in some other place? And then immediately you're in the position of defending a hypothetical rebel's choice instead of describing why that choice happened in a material historical circumstance. So, this is what the question, do you condemn Hamas, is often all about. It's about collapsing all of history into a single moment or equation of morality so that you and your perspective can be dismissed as quickly as possible if you hesitate or offer nuance. This is why we can read Kwame Ture in 1969 writing, "It is not a question of whether it is right to kill or it is wrong to kill. Killing goes on." And then he goes on to explain that the only real question is who is legally allowed to do that killing. Angela Davis, while in prison on weapons and murder charges she was later acquitted of, was asked by a journalist once if she approved of violence in self-defense. She replied, "The person who's asking that question has absolutely no idea what Black people have gone through in this country since the time the first Black person was kidnapped from the shores of Africa." What Toure and Davis and Frantz Fanon before them are exposing is that violence is not something that just periodically breaks out and disrupts the peace because some people have decided to break a moral taboo. They are saying violence is a constant reality in an unequal society, and a society's moral evaluations tend to favor those in positions of power. So, here's part 2 of my interview with Ben Case. You know, one of the things about the joy that erupted through the memification of Richard Spencer getting punched is that I don't know if you have this in your memory, maybe you have it in your fighting career, I'm not sure, but what I remember in my body as I watched that was the times where I was able to sort of unequivocally, without any sort of doubt or hesitation, I was able to punch somebody who was bullying me. And, I'm talking about being maybe 9 years old, maybe 11 years old or something like that. And to this moment, actually, I'm 53 and I can remember the feeling of my fist hitting this kid's cheek and him going down and knowing he was never going to bother me again. And that was so powerful that it stayed with me forever. Now, here's the thing though, when I think back to that moment, I also realize, oh, there was a real risk there too, right? That I couldn't really control, I couldn't really sort of predict or think forward and through. And that was that I could have really injured him, right? And so, I mean, and you're going to be familiar with this from professional fighting. I guess I want to ask about this other dimension, which is that, if you agree with your community that punching Richard Spencer or something like that is an appropriate protective action against a fascist street threat, what are the consequences that you all have to consider if you're just going to also remain people who are human beings engaged with other human beings that, when they take actions, they know they might have really negative consequences for an individual?
I think first and foremost, we have to be aware of the potential, the likelihood for physical response against our communities. Again, whether it's fascists in the streets that are not wearing uniforms or are wearing uniforms, we have to be aware of the possibility and the likelihood that there's reprisal for this sort of a thing.
Right.
Now that doesn't mean, and that can get used sometimes to say, well, then we should never do anything that would provoke them, because I think that just leads to capitulation to authoritarianism.
Right.
But I do think that is an honest and important thing to take responsibility for, and that if we're going to do things like that in organized ways, then we need to also be prepared to take responsibility for that on the other ends, and being, and I think there's a lot of people who do the one sort of thing are also engaged in mutual aid networks, for example, and taking that seriously. And like,
Right.
we have to care for each other as well. If people do something like this and, get arrested, we have to be prepared to provide legal support or try to bail them out or show up for them in other ways, and so sort of looking at the full spectrum of consequences of our actions as much as possible, I think is important. You asked sort of a different question, though. That was my sort of instinct at first, but you were asking about taking responsibility for potentially hurting other people.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting, and I think that that's important to wrestle with. So I think about Hannah Arendt is one of my sort of intellectual inspirations in different ways, and she said at some point that in writing about violence, that sometimes the most human response to something at certain times is acting without thought for the future in that moment.
Right.
And I think a lot of the sort of little violence actions we're talking about come from that, like standing up to a bully. In that moment, it's just important to do that thing without considering the future consequences. Like sometimes that is a deeply human activity and very important.
Right.
On the flip side, it is also important to then, once you're out of that moment, take responsibility for the consequences of your actions. And I guess, we never know. Our lives are always unfolding, it seems, in one direction, but it's like, your life could have gone very differently if that person had been grievously injured. Like, you don't know.
That's exactly it. That's exactly, because I'm thinking about like the paradox of, oh, I actually had almost like an ecstatic moment of freedom by taking this action, and I dropped him, and he was never going to hurt me again. And what if I had paralyzed him? Then what? Right? Like, because we're also just kids.
Yeah.
and so when I think about discussing this with my own kids or with other young people, it's like, I don't think that I want to put any sort of chilling effect upon the things that you need to do physically to feel as though you're providing safety for yourself and your community. And at the same time, you are probably going to have to live, well, you are going to have to live with the consequences of the things that happen in those events.
Yeah, totally. And I think, again, being a person in community means be responsible and accountable for your actions in collaboration with other people.
Yeah.
I also think, though, that like, if that had happened, again, we're happy it didn't. If that had happened, I think what actually taking responsibility would have meant in a collective sense would have been, yes, you taking responsibility for throwing the punch that had that action, but also the bully taking responsibility for putting you in that position where you felt in that moment that you had to do that.
Yeah.
That's a relationship. And, responsibility does not just go one way in terms of the zoomed in specific action, but is part of a social context. And so, I do think there's a sort of collective element to actual real responsibility instead of just sort of a sense of guilt, which you may have also felt and had to deal with in your life and in your community.
Yeah, I think you're saying something really important, because I am sort of focusing on the personal guilt aspect in the aftermath of something like that. But actually, the broader context of why that happens is that there is a unsafe school environment in which the teachers are well aware that there's bullying going on. They don't really give a shit about it. They probably think it's part of it is appropriate. They think that that's how they grew up. They think that, somehow that's how kids get tough or something like that. And so there's an aiding and abetting of violent circumstances that, winds up exploding in a particular moment. And I think that's part of the larger context, and if I extrapolate that out to, what are the larger systems that we live in, if we live in, global North capitalism, we are in an environment that aids and abets violence and exploitation all the time, and that becomes a pressure cooker.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about it in terms of a metaphor and saying the bully also bears responsibility, but you brought in the much more important factor, which is actually the context that this is even happening in, and that you were kids. And I think that's exactly right. I don't think that the existence of global capitalism doesn't exonerate us from any action we take within that system.
Yeah,
but I do think that it is all part of a conversation around honestly taking responsibility for our actions when there are severe consequences.
What is the most important thing that you learned about yourself and other people in your professional fighting career?
For me, the practice of sport fighting and training was about, I mean, to go back to to sort of where we started, I think it is the practice of bravery. And it's like, your situation with the bully, which you were learning in real time. It's kind of it's like engineering, putting yourself in that situation in different instances where you feel like, are you gonna fight someone else to protect your own physical safety, someone who's trying to hurt you? Are you gonna hurt them more and better? It's But in a situation where you're both agreeing to be there, you're sort of engineering this situation where you can practice that bravery.
Right.
And practice also that sort of that awareness again of like hurt versus injury and those sorts of things. And at the end of the day, I think that's what sport fighting is. I think that's why people like watching it. I think that's what the appeal of that is over, for example, in some like, I love watching a lot of team sports as well. But when it comes to sport fighting, it's one person against one person, and we're watching in real time this human drama play out where, among other things, we get to see courage or fear taking over, and people sort of wrestling with that in themselves and with each other, literally in the moment.
Right.
And I found for me practicing that was, you learn a lot about yourself in different instances where you did step up, or where you didn't meet the moment, or where you can feel that, in that you can like better identify that specific moment of, there's a fork in the road right now. I go this way or this way. Like, am I going to fight? Am I going to take a knee? Am I going to bat, like that sort of a thing? And I think I've found that extremely valuable, for myself and in life. And it's one of the things that I love about the sport, and why I try to stay involved in it.
One thing that occurs to me is that I imagine that sport fighting training and doing it professionally would also really make it palpable that in your political life or in our political life, there are absolute conflicts between interests that cannot be avoided, right? One of the things that I just seem to run up against a lot in, political discourse in various places is a kind of oblivion or forgetfulness that, you know, actually there are some people who have power and they are not going to give it up. And there's no incentive for them to give it up. There's no history behind them giving it up. They have their class interests, if we use that language, and they're opposed to people who don't have their class interests. And so there must be something about being in that ring that really gives you sort of practice in understanding that sometimes there are zero sum conflicts between people, and they have to be decided.
Yeah, this is one of the problems with liberalism, specifically in a moment when liberalism is crumbling
Yeah.
all around us. But a lot of people, stay tethered to these ideas that no, things can get solved all through polite compromise and through following the rules, and we can all. And it's not always the case, right? There are at times absolute conflict. And I think, yeah, the thing about sport fighting, obviously, it's like they say, all sport is sublimated warfare, they say. But which I don't know if I entirely agree with that. But the close, but one-on-one fighting is the closest you're actually going to get in a lot of ways to that. And I think it is really useful for that, to do it, to watch it, to be engaged in it. I also think, just because my instinct is always to find nuance in things, I think that's right. I also think it can help us understand the ways that even absolute conflicts can break down if you push them to their limit. So
Right.
in theory, yeah. So two fighters are in the ring. You try to make it as fair as possible. They're the same weight. They're this roughly the same training level or whatever it is, and the same skill. And then you see who can impose their will on the other person. They're both trying to do that, and this is, again, it's a sublimated absolute conflict. And in theory, both are in there just as motivated as the other. But you learn that you can actually push someone to quit at times.
Right.
You can push someone to the point when they do decide, no, it's not worth it. And I think that's the case in absolute conflicts in the real world too. There are times when it is absolute in the truest well, most absolute sense. But there's other times that it seems that way only up until you push it to the brink, but you have to be willing to take it there.
Right.
And then sometimes it turns out the other side actually might make different choices, and you don't know. But again, that's part of that's part of the bravery is preparing ourselves and being willing sometimes to take it as far as we need to for the sake of human dignity and freedom and the possibility of a flourishing world that works for all of us.
You said something at the beginning about you don't know how it's going to turn out until afterwards. And I think that the thing that comes to mind with regard to what you're describing about you can push a person or you can push an opponent to backing off is that is sort of one of the basic lessons of the Richard Spencer incident, which is at a certain point, it costs too much for him to show up and keep doing his bullshit. And I think similarly, we're seeing a number of incidences in which local community they're working in concert with each other to really chase ICE contingents out of town to the point where for those agents, it's not worth it for them to stay there. They're not being paid enough. There's not enough of them. They can't be successful at what they're supposed to be doing, and they have to fall back.
Yeah, it's one of the most inspiring things I've seen in a long time is that type of resistance in communities where people just say, no, you're not
doing that.
taking our neighbor away. This person who's, yeah, no, absolutely not. And like, if enough people show up, ultimately, like, people power is where it's at. And we see that in those moments, exactly as you say. Yeah.
Often, what I'm seeing is folks who get an alert on their phone because they're using the de-icer app or something like that, and they know that, oh, the agents are showing up, this is the block or this is the part of town, and we should gather there in 10 minutes. And people who have been working night shift or they've picked up their kids from school or something like that, there are people who show up in their shower shoes, in their pajamas to yell at the agents. And there's something about that really breaks the mold of forceful protests. Are they violent? Are they ill-conceived? No. Sometimes it's just people doing exactly what people would do if their families or their community members were threatened.
Yeah. And in fact, it's funny because the terms we use for this, like, we talk about like a protest, like capital P protest.
Yeah.
All protests and demonstrations are just theater for what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Right. They're just like they're a demonstration of we could do things like that. But that sort of just people taking action in those sorts of ways together, that is the crux of people power. And, in a certain sense, the reason we do mass protests or marches is to remind ourselves and other people that we can do that kind of a thing. But that is really what it comes down to. That's what power hinges on, is people being willing to do things like that.
Last question. Let's say you are leading a class in self-defense or in fighting sports for young anti-fascists. What core values would you want to help them foster?
I mean, I guess there's all the sort of more the cliche things about, you sort of like learning your own strengths and learning to stand up for yourself in your community and, learning that you can do things you didn't realize you could do before. That's all true. I think it comes down to, I mean, it's like, it's Sun Tzu, right? It's know yourself and know your adversary.
Yeah.
I think that's what it comes down to. It comes down to our ability to know who we are, what we can do, how we can push ourselves, sometimes beyond what we thought we could do, where our limits are, and being able to read and understand, the adversaries that we're up against, and know how we can take action to better our lives, whether that's just like feeling good about yourself, feeling like you can defend yourself and the people around you, and feeling more energized, doing something that's fun in terms of the exercise of it, or whether that's testing yourself in other ways, or all the way up to actually knowing that you can show up in your bathrobe or whatever, in your like slippers and your shoes, to tell an ICE agent to like get the hell out of your community. And again, the sort of knowing your adversary, I think that kind of training can help you read people sometimes and read where they're at and look in someone's eyes and kind of see where they're at or where they're coming from, and be able to read that and sort of plan your own actions accordingly. Yeah, I don't know if that's Off the top of my head, that's not a very concise way of putting it, but I guess.
Well, I think it really forces you to bring these two parts of your life really close together, right? It's like you have this amazing physical training, and then it is connected to your research in the physical reality of social change movements, and it's like I'm sure you're going to be on that journey for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, I could tell plenty of stories about it. I don't know how much you want to hear about that, but it is like, obviously it's not consequential in the ways that political movements are. Like, again, it's a game at the end of the day. It's a sport, right? It's not important in those ways, but I find importance in how it can help us practice those moments and learn about them and understand them. So the moments when, like, there's a fight, there's an instance I was fighting in Thailand against somebody who was bigger than me and better and expected to win, and was scary, and his people were getting in my head ahead of the fight, and I was in the worst mindset you could possibly be. I was like, oh my god, like, if this guy hurts me, it's not just like I don't just get hurt now. Like, what if I get brain injuries, and what if my whole life is is this worth it? Am I not getting paid enough for this? This was the mindset I was in before getting in the ring, before this particular fight.
Right.
And I told myself, if he's too much for you, if you get hit, if you get hurt, just stay down. It's not worth it. It's like, it's not worth it for the rest of your life for this. Like, that's the mindset I was actually in. Right.
Right.
And then I got in there, and then he did hit me hard and hurt me and knock me down. And I got up and I was like, oh, hell no, let's go. Like,
wow.
There was not even, in the moment, it was like not even and I was even a little bit aware, like, well, this is that moment you thought about. And it didn't even enter my mind that I would stay down. I was like, no, let's go. And we had an absolute war of a fight. I ended up winning. I knocked him out in I think the 4th round. But that's an example of teaching me, like, you can think whatever you want ahead of time, but it really comes down to that moment,
right?
What you're going to do in that moment. And that's what all the training is for.
Right.
That's what all the practice and the training is. So in that moment, you make that decision.
That is an amazing story to end on, but it's like, I don't want anybody to have the illusion that somehow you stood up and because you decided that's why you won, because you could have stood up and not won as well, right?
Totally. Yeah. I could have gotten hurt. Exactly what I was afraid of could have happened.
Yeah. So somehow you overrode the planning, the thinking about the consequences. You overrode the future because something about being knocked down, it forced you to get back up.
Yeah. And it wasn't even about like knowing I would win. I think even if I had lost, having done that would be important to me,
right,
to my dignity, to like, no, I wasn't going to just accept that and quit.
Right.
I was going to fight until I wasn't able to, because that's what the sport asks, if demands of you as an athlete, as a fighter.
Right.
And that's what the audience expects, as like to see people if they're going to quit or not, and the, I think there's something similar when it comes to, we talked about like acting without regard for the future in some instances, where sometimes it's not about, you don't get a guarantee that this is going to work or not.
Right.
Sometimes you have to act in that, for again, human dignity, not to be grandiose about it, because this is a sport. But I think when it comes to, political movements, yeah, sometimes we have to act for human dignity without knowing 100% this is going to work or not, or, we should think strategic, we should plan strategic. There's no question about it. But also in the moment, sometimes you have to take action for a better world, not knowing whether or not it's going to work.
That's a great place to end, Ben. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate your research, and yeah, thank you.
Thanks for having me on. This is great.
Okay, as promised, I wanted to take some time to flag an important and what I predict will be an ongoing story that combines a number of themes. On one level, it's about men, trauma, internet alienation, and wounded and wounding behavior. But on a second level, it's about how we form our impressions of people and their politics through fragmentary information, and how we come to trust others, especially in the internet age, when it's painfully common to wonder, is that guy secretly a Nazi? But then there's a third level, which is about whether we live in a culture in which we recognize the signs of a lived life, and whether we believe in signs of change. Can people who have acted in conflicted and harmful ways ever be entrusted to public service? Or do we want leaders grown in law school test tubes or think tank labs who have never risked anything or done anything stupid? Can we tolerate a person being complex over time? Now, this is a very parent-child, family, community-level issue, I think, because in real life, we are usually in the exact position that online life allows us to avoid, which is this question of how do we tolerate, how do we set boundaries with, or how do we forgive the people that we need to live with every day? So you might have guessed that the story is about Maine Democratic Senate candidate Graham Platner and his Reddit history and his Nazi tattoo. And before I get into the details, I just want to say a bit about why the online milieu in this story is important for my beat, even if the details of Platner's narrative don't follow the typical lines. A big part of the groundwork for this podcast is an examination of the effects of internet culture on boys and young men, including the influence of charismatic figures and how over the past 10 to 12 years, so many of the cultural supports for fascism developed in isolated and isolating internet petri dishes that just reek of testosterone. Over the next little while, I'll actually have episodes with Cy Cantarell, with Dale Baran, and Taylor Lorenz about their research into these matters since about 2017. From what I've seen, there are two basic approaches, which I think are especially pertinent for parents, in looking at internet spaces where this combination of anonymity and alienation seems to permit all manner of behavior. Now, one approach is to instinctively clamp down, to want to regulate, to quarantine it, to feel very anxious that one's own sons will be drawn into it, like, will they be able to recognize the Nazi in the chat? Like, these are reasonable responses because toxic online culture, especially of the masculine type, is real, it's harmful, it can metastasize. You have to be vigilant about it. It gave rise to Andrew Tate. It gave rise to QAnon. Now, where the quarantine or disgust approach can be blindered is in its avoidance of the more holistic approach of asking fundamental questions about why young men are in certain places, how many different pathways they took to get to those places, and whether providing them resources is more effective ultimately than hand-wringing and stigma and notions of discipline. That disgust reflex can compound the social isolation of guys who are stuck in those spaces. In fact, for many of them, it's the precondition for being in manosphere spaces. They already feel socially rejected. But of course, the liability of this whole track of thinking, this root cause approach, is that you can wind up spending too much time empathizing with people who really have crossed over into a fascist territory in a concrete way. So walking this line between quarantine and reaching out really depends on the amount of social capital that you have with that son of yours, with that nephew, with that neighbor. Okay, so that's my little analysis on the status of the internet as a political reality in men's lives. It's a scary place and a place perhaps of potential because, after all, it spat out Kash Patel and Dan Bongino to work as flunkies for Trump. But was it also a factor in Graham Platner's long journey to public service through a kind of catharsis? So who is he? Platner is 41. He's a Marine veteran of 4 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. And today he's a Marlboro man, handsome oyster farmer with a deep voice that he's not afraid to raise in populist indignation. And he's the current frontrunner in the Democratic Senate primary race to challenge Republican Susan Collins for the seat that she's clung to for 28 years. And Platner has done this on a platform of Medicare for all, economic justice, labor support, criticizing Israel harshly, and rebuking the U.S. military imperialism he was part of. He's been drawing raucous crowds of hundreds to town halls all over rural Maine. Now, Platner has spoken openly about suffering from PTSD from intense combat experiences, which included machine gunning other human beings in Baghdad, in Ramadi, And also he took part in anti-piracy operations off the coast of Somalia. So he got paid by American taxpayers to go to the Middle East and kill people, and we don't know how many. And this has led to, as he says, very dark periods in his life. And then he also says that the VA saved him. And that is a key talking point on the stump as he rails against Trump slashing services to the people he now wants to send to war in South America. So up to this point, this story sounds like Bernie Sanders' left-wing Democrat gold, and Bernie himself has been a strong Platner supporter. He seems to be almost the perfect candidate to speak to all the heartland, erstwhile Democrat men who voted for Trump last time around. Platner seems to offer a wounded but recovering, a muscular yet compassionate model of masculinity. Now, Platner presents as working class, but not necessarily by destiny. There do seem to be some choices involved in his life arc and some twists and turns. His father is a lawyer and former assistant district attorney and a regular Democratic Party donor. His mother owns a restaurant business. The parents divorced when he was a kid. One grandfather was a notable modernist architect who designed major buildings at Yale University and Lincoln Center in New York. And Graham briefly attended a private boarding school in Connecticut where tuition today can be as high as $70,000 per year. But he graduated from another high school, also private and closer to home, and with a far lower tuition of about $6,000 per year. Now, we don't know if he received scholarships or subsidies for either of those two pieces of his education. Enlisting in the Marine Corps was driven by idealism and adventurism. I thought I could do some good, he told the New Republic, and I wanted to play soldier. I might have read too much Hemingway. But then there's also a story from back in August, run in the Bangor Daily News, that as an 18-year-old, Platner got kicked out of a George W. Bush event in 2002 for protesting the looming invasion of Iraq. So there are lots of class and career and political tensions in this story. And now he's come clean, or almost clean, about the fact that when he wrapped up his military career in 2016, he was suffering from PTSD and spending too much time on Reddit, where he indulged in some aggressive and offensive commenting. He called it shitposting. Now, the comments express mainly leftist views through crass male military humor that's waving all kinds of red flags for racism and sexism. So, for instance, he wondered back in 2013 why black people don't tip more in restaurants. He used homophobic slurs and he minimized the impacts of sexual assault on women in the military. But then in many posts, he just sounds like a communist tanky. Not that tankies can't be racist and sexist, but the focus is really on revolution. He refers to all police as bastards. He talks about rural white Americans as racist and stupid. And he does identify himself outright as a communist and expresses support for violent revolutionary action, talking about, everybody needs to be familiar with semi-automatic weapons if they really want to defend themselves against fascism. What I see in reviewing these comments is a depressive and angry leftism expressing resentment and disillusionment and occasionally punching down at the perceived distractions of identity politics. And all of this is within the context of war trauma. Now, within days of the news breaking, he spoke to the ethics of his comments in what I would describe as a rare display of accountability.
Hey all, it's Graham here. As you've probably seen, there's a story that's broken about comments I made on Reddit in an earlier part of my life. As I read through them, I read things that I absolutely do not agree with. I read through and I see things words and statements that I abhor. I also see the trajectory of my life. When I got back from Afghanistan in 2011, I stayed in the Army for another year. I got out in 2012. Some of the worst comments I made, the things that I think are least defensible, that I wouldn't even try to defend, come from that time. I had spent the bulk of my 20s in the infantry, deploying overseas, fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, the infantry was a very male-dominated place. It's a very masculine world. When I was in, women weren't allowed in the infantry. It's changed now, and that's a good thing. But when I got out, I still had the crude humor, the dark feelings, the offensive language that really was a hallmark of the infantry when I was in it.
So that's on October 17th. And I have to say that in purely literary terms, I thought his star was rising even brighter, because not only is he stumping on the economic justice platforms that are bottom line for addressing fascism, he seems to be embodying the same healing arc that progressives are praying men can take. And then when he's shown his own shadow, he owns it. But not so fast, because on October 20th, it comes to light that Platner has a Nazi Totenkopf skull and crossbones tattoo on his right pec. So there's another apology forthcoming. He claims he got it while drunk in the service in Croatia in 2007, and that he had no idea that this extremely famous Nazi symbol was associated with, you guessed it, the Nazis. Now, many folks, including me, found this impossible to believe, given his military history knowledge and his presumed commitment to anti-fascism. You know, it's really hard to believe that he didn't learn what that was over 18 years and then want to have it removed and then taking the steps it took to remove it. Now, by October the 24th, CNN had confirmed reports that as late as 2020 on Reddit, Platner, under his username phustle, was discussing the strangeness of Nazi tattoos in the US military on Reddit. He was saying that Nazi insignia like the double bolts could be used by white and black and Latino servicemen alike, presumably to signify ruthlessness. So he likely knew what that tattoo was, and he tried on a lie to start. And at this point, if he has common political scruples, he has every motivation to continue to lie about the tattoo and hope it gets buried under his continued polling success. But a question that I have is whether it would be impossible for him to fully outline the paradoxes of using this imagery in the US military. Because I can imagine a world in which a character like Platner knows what the tattoo is absolutely, and that he gets it as a Marine with a growing conscience. And not only is it a sign of vengeance and scariness, as he describes it in his apology, but it's also a mark of Cain, and that he keeps it on his body to remind him of his sins, or perhaps to normalize the part of him that was sent abroad to murder people. Now, in some of the Reddit comments, he's chiding the normies for not understanding the moral complexity of being in the US military. So in this fictional story that I'm imagining, the tattoo expresses his self-loathing as an imperial murderer, and his Reddit persona carries that cynical, in-the-know, on-the-verge of black-pilled energy that can really tilt in any political direction, which is why it's so volatile. Now, in response to the revelations and Platner's apologies, factions have emerged and hardened, and they run the gamut from, well, he's obviously a covert fascist who's cosplaying as a progressive, and we've got to cut him loose, to, well, he's a guy who messed up and he's owning it, and more than that, using his experience of his political disempowerment and of having stared into the jaws of the empire to find the right answers by leaning towards socialism, he is of value to us. Now, as I'm recording this, Platner is still leading in most polls over the centrist pick of the Democrat establishment, 77-year-old Maine Governor Janet Mills. And so the folks of Maine who will have the last word at the polls at the primary in June are leaning towards that latter, well, it looks like he's reformed and he might be a powerful advocate, the kind that we need position. Here's what I'd like to propose for parents and caregivers of boys and young men who are interested in this story, who might be talking about it and wondering about all of its implications as it plays out. I would say that on a public level, this is a morality play of Jungian dimensions. And when I say play, I mean fiction in the sense that no one outside of Platner, his close people, and his therapist will get close to the truth of what that tattoo means to him. We all have to make our guess, especially voters in Maine. They'll be doing that on a gut level, and there will be an inevitable gap between what they know about Platner and why they pull that lever. Now, the Platner Spectacle is a rich discussion topics for boys and young men in several ways, I believe. I mean, first of all, it's a great character study, a great exploration of the arc and flow of a person as they go through the trauma of war and are potentially illuminated, but how they might struggle to come to that clarity through periods of depression and resentment. Secondly, I think this story allows us to recognize that fighting over the veracity of Platner's narrative is going to be a highly motivated activity no matter what direction you're coming at it from. The GOP is happy about this story for obvious reasons, but the Democratic leadership is also happy to find something disqualifying about a candidate that ruthlessly attacks its donor class and foreign policy. And then those who are actually on the anti-capitalist left will be tortured by this question of whether to believe and forgive him. And the stakes are high because we desperately need some kind of relief from business as usual, from centrism. Now, another rich point of discussion might come from learning about Dunbar's number. This is a concept proposed by the British anthropologist Robin Dunbar, who said that humans can maintain stable social relationships with about 150 people before things get strange. So this is the number of individuals one can know personally and how they relate to each other. So, what are their family structures? What are their family histories? How well do you know your neighbors? Now, he came up with this limit from primate studies that linked brain size, especially the size of the neocortex, to social group size. And that led Dunbar to extrapolate a human average of 150. So in other words, our brains are large enough and complex enough to keep about 150 relationships straight in our heads, functional, vibrant, dynamic, alive. We can interact with 150 real people. And then beyond that, something else has to happen. So this is Dunbar's social brain hypothesis. And what he says is that beyond the threshold of about 150, of course, it's not like written in stone, but around that number, cohesive group dynamics will weaken unless we have formal rules or hierarchies, or unless we abstract others into narratives and categories that we make up for them. So I think when we really try to guess about what's going on with Graham Platner, we have to experience a category error where our expectation for him to be in that circle of 150 is strong and maybe even strengthened deceptively by populist politics, but he's not actually in that circle of 150. We are all dealing in personality-based economies that operate at an abstract scale. And I think every young person can ponder the fact that we cannot really place any ultimate trust in the spectacle of charismatic or highly visible people outside of our in real life social brain, especially if they are in electoral politics. So if there's something to learn from Graham Platner as a contradictory political actor, it's the reminder that in real life trust is built in small networks and communities where we don't have to guess or lay bets on where charismatic people stand. To the extent that we look to the internet spectacle for meaning and inspiration, we will be confounded by memes and performances of personae. So to whatever extent we're able, I think we want to help young people learn how to look through these veils of fragmentary commentary and charisma, but not so that they become cynics, not so that they get stuck in the no man's land between the social and the parasocial, The masks of public life will always betray our values. That's why the bulk of our politics has to be built in everyday, neighborly activities amongst people whose good work you cannot evaluate by scrolling. Thanks for listening, everyone. Keep each other safe.